Okay, hi everyone. Good morning. So we officially begin today the 7th session of the Faura Project's webinar series on heritage cities and streets. So for the house rules, we would just like to request all the participants here today to mute their microphones until asked otherwise. But don't worry, there will be a Q&A portion after our speaker segment. So if you have any questions, you can just list them down first and ask them during the Q&A portion. So before we begin our webinar session for today, I'd like to check in on everyone here first. How are you feeling this bright Sunday morning for our audience from the Philippines and for our audience in Australia? How are you feeling this bright Sunday afternoon? So please send one word in the Zoom chat to describe how you're feeling right now so that we can check in on each other before we start. So are you feeling hungry? Okay, so Melina is feeling great. Jazz is feeling excited. How about the others? Fabulous. Feeling great. All right. Yes, ready to start. All right, actually us too. So yes, before let's not make this any longer. Let's begin. So to introduce our activity today a little bit better and also to introduce our speaker for today is the activity convener, Dr. Honey Libertine Achanzar-Labor, Executive Director of the Faura Project and a professor at the University of the Philippines, Manila, and the University of the Philippines Open University. So again, let's all welcome Dr. Labor.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So the Faura Project is an organization of alumni, faculty, current students and friends of the University of the Philippines, Manila, bound by a common cause, which is to revive, revitalize, and sustain the rich cultural and historical heritage of Ermita, Manila, particularly along Project Faura Street and its environs. No? So this is the group which is organizing this activity, no? The Faura Project. So its interest goes beyond the street of Calle Faura do, as it aims to also support and promote heritage-laden streets and their advocates in the country, as we will see again in today's webinar podcast, even outside the region. So all of this is anchored on the premium we in the Faura Project give to learning from best practices in heritage-related endeavors in the Philippines and abroad. So our activity today is also most timely since we are celebrating in the Philippines the Museum and Gallery Month. And I was also informed by our speaker, a Filipina now based in Australia, that October has been declared as History Month for Australia. So let me now proceed to formally introduce our speaker. So for today, we have our speaker is a curator and exhibitions manager of the Museum of Chinese-Australian History, associate professor at the Philippine Women's University, and a researcher in heritage and an academic at the University of Melbourne. She was born and has lived, worked, and studied in the Philippines, but has also studied and worked in Singapore, in the United States, and Australia, where she currently is. She has held positions at the Ayala Museum and Lopez Museum and Library, as well as graduate internship roles at the Smithsonian National University or Museum at the American History, also in Horn Museum of Art, Florida Museum of Natural History, and San Diego Museum of Art. So Ethel, our guest, has a PhD from the University of Melbourne, a master's in museology, major in education from the University of Florida, and a bachelor's in Philippine Arts, major in arts management from the University of the Philippines, Manila. Her PhD research curated learning, focused on identifying teaching strategies of museums that school teachers can adopt to help students engage in deep learning. So she has been awarded a number of prestigious international, academic, and professional scholarships, including the Fulbright Scholarship, the Asian Cultural Council Fellowship, which is an affiliate of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the Melbourne International Research Scholarship. She is also the principal author of Making Museums Work, a zero-in handbook, the first comprehensive and practical handbook on establishing and managing museums in the Philippines. So Ethel remains active in museums in the Philippines. Now, she has been conducting programs aimed at sharing expertise and resources in working towards developing more dynamic, engaging, and inviting cultural centers all over the Philippines. In 2013, she co-created and co-facilitated workshop modules for the UNESCO Philippines funded Zero-in National Workshop on Establishing Museums. Encouraged by the success of the first workshop, 2 more workshops were awarded funds and held in 2014 and 2015. So over 200 participants representing more than 100 museums, cultural institutions across the Philippines attended the workshops, modules of which were based on her master's project thesis on creating classroom museums in the Philippines. So moreover, our speaker is a plantita as she enjoys tending to her urban garden in her spare time. So without further ado, let us give a virtual applause to our speaker today, Dr. Ethel Villafranca. Okay, and good morning to all. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Please just allow me a few seconds to share my screen and hope that we don't have any issues. All right, I think, can you guys see it?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Let me do the presentation. All right, there we go. Ooh. We're off to a good start with no technical issue from my side. All right. Since I am presenting all the way from Melbourne, Australia, I would like to begin with Australian custom of acknowledgement of country. Woman Jeka. My name is Ethel Villafranca, and I acknowledge that I am an uninvited Filipino guest living and working on the land belonging to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my deepest respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Thank you, Levy, for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. As Levy has mentioned, I am the Curator and Exhibitions Manager of the Museum of Chinese-Australian History, which is based here in Melbourne, Australia. Since we have a lot of people watching us from outside Australia, let's step back and find our geographical bearing for Little Bourke Street in Melbourne. So, Melbourne, pronounced locally as Melbourne, is the capital of the state of Victoria. That's that one over there, the purple one. The other Australian states are New South Wales, where you'd be familiar with the Sydney Opera House, Tasmania, which you'd know from the Tasmanian Devil, Queensland, which would be your gateway to the Great Barrier Reef. And we also have Western Australia and South Australia. South Australia. Then we have 2 territories, Australian Capital Territory, right here. Where's ACT? There's ACT, where the capital, Canberra, is located. Can someone mute the pinging of when people come in? It's a bit distracting. Sorry about that. And then we also have Northern Territory. And right there, you will see the Uluru, which is a sacred site for the Aboriginal people. Has anyone been to the Uluru? I loved going there and learning more about the history and tradition of the Aboriginal people. Now, within Melbourne is the Central Business District, or what we commonly call here as the CBD. That is the area right here, right, where it's bounded by the red dotted line. There are a few points of interest that I wish to highlight. For example, the Parliament House. Ooh, my screen is a little bit small. Let me see. Parliament House here. Parliament House is right here. And then we have Flinders Street Station on the other here, right here, almost at the bottom. Then we have the main library, main state library of Melbourne, this one here. Not sure if you can see my cursor. Can you see my arrow? Could someone?
Yes, we see it, Ethel.
All right, great. And then we have the Museums Victoria, which is the State Museum. It's somewhere here. We can't see it from here. Okay, and then we have Swanston Street right here. Where's Swanston? Yeah, right here. Where's my mouse? There, right here. That's Swanston Street, which is essentially the main street of the Central Business District. Now, Chinatown is right here where you have the pink rectangle. And Lil Bourke in particular, which we are focusing on, is this street over here. It's right smack in the middle of Chinatown. Okay, as you can see, compared to Chinatown in Manila or Binondo, which has several malls and shopping centers, our Chinatown here in Melbourne is very small. Okay, Little Bourke is just here, our focus. So that's straight over there. Now, here's a close-up of the boundary of Chinatown. The heart of Chinatown is concentrated along Lil Bourke Street. It extends a little bit beyond Exhibition Street, all right, up there. And then it also shows up in this map. We also see Spring Street, okay, where you can see the Tianjin Garden, which was collaboratively designed by both designers from City of Melbourne and Tianjin City in China, which is a sister city of Melbourne. And if you walk along Lil Bourke Street, you'll end up in in Swanston Street. Chinatown includes all these laneways over here, okay, and alleys which link the area to Lil Bourke Street and Lonsdale Street over there. Now, Melbourne is notable for its creative laneways, some of which have very beautiful street art. In the Philippines, we call these tiny streets esquinita. Now, why are all these small streets? Why are there small streets? Okay, well, these are actually service lanes for the main streets, for which serves as docking areas for delivery carriages. They would pass through there and offload supplies through the docking area of the buildings that are primarily located in the main street, off of the main street. Now, so the main streets are the ones that don't have the name Little on them. Silly story that I wanted to share, when I just first moved in Melbourne, I would see all these street signs that says LT Bourke, LT Lonsdale. And I thought to myself, oh, they name a lot of streets here after military people, because I thought, oh, lieutenant, they have so many lieutenants here. And then I realized, oh, it's not lieutenant, it's Little. So anyway, that's a side story, silly side story from me. So we have the main street named Bourke, Lonsdale, what else? There's no Little Swanston, okay? And then in between them would have the smaller streets labeled Little. So Little Bourke Street is right here. So now that we're all geographically oriented, let's get started. So as some of you may already know, it was the Australian gold rush that attracted a large number of Chinese people to go to Australia. But did you know that there were already Chinese migrants in Australia long before the Australian gold rush? So one of these first recorded Chinese migrant is Mak Saying, who arrived as a free settler in Port Jackson, New South Wales. Can you guess what year he arrived? So type your answer in the chat. Oops, no. There we go. Let's see what the answers. A, B, we have a lot of B. A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. Okay, so let's find out. Let's watch this video. Can you all see my screen showing that website of the Chinese Museum?
Yes, Ethel?
Yes.
Great, sorry, I always need to check because I've had previously difficulty. All right, I'll just share this.
And the unknown future ahead. During the 19th and 20th century, there were no people more courageous than those who travelled across the sea to a distant place with only memories behind them and the unknown future ahead. Over the last 200 years, Chinese have been arriving in Australia from the mainland and Southeast Asia. 1 million stories is about their trials, tribulations and triumphs in the land they now call home. And the stories begin with the first generation arrivals.
My name is Nick Shine and I am the great-great-great-grandson of Mak Saying, the first known Chinese immigrant to Australia. He arrived in 1818, 200 years ago.
But even before the British colonists arrived in 1788, there already had been indirect contact between Aboriginal clans and Chinese traders.
My name is Carol Moore. My great-grandfather Panlook came to Australia from Canton in the early 1850s. He was a young gold miner up in the Buckland Valley in northeastern Victoria. Sadly, tragically, his shop was burnt down in the 1857 Buckland riot.
My grandfather, Chin Man Fung, came to Australia in 1917. It was a very difficult time. There was a white Australia policy in place in Australia. There was turmoil in China. There was unrest and subsequent depression in the 30s, Japanese invasion and the Chinese Civil War.
Today, most Australians have ancestors who made the great effort to migrate to Australia to escape tremendous adversity or to chase opportunity in a new land.
I arrived in Melbourne in December 1959 and from Malaysia. At that time, education in Australia is well known due to the Colombo Plan Scholarship. And when I was here, the white Australian policy was still in existence. So it was very much an Anglo-Saxon community. And so multiculturalism as it is today does not exist.
My parents arrived in Australia from Vietnam in 1978 as humanitarian refugees. When they arrived in Australia, in Melbourne, they had nothing. They had to start afresh.
My name is Vivian Wang. I came 2006 as an overseas student from Tianjin, which is the sister city with Melbourne. So I used to be studying international finance. I see there's so many lovely cakes. I suddenly changed my career to a pastry chef to settle my life in Australia.
There are now over 1.2 million Australians of Chinese ancestry living in Australia that continue the journey that their ancestors began as part of the Australian national identity.
All right. So what's the correct answer? The correct answer is 1818. What's that? Letter B. Congratulations to those who got it correct. You have won. Applause. Give yourself a pat on your back. All right, let's move on. So the video that you just saw is a video or an introductory video of the Museum of Chinese-Australian History's latest long-term exhibition, 1 million stories. It is currently on view in the museum, and hopefully after the restrictions, locally and internationally, some of you can come visit. And later I will tell you more about the museum. Now, many sojourners from China came to Australia from the Siop district, where about 80% of Chinese immigrants during the Australian gold rush hailed. Now, I need to make a distinction, okay? I'm using the word sojourners instead of migrants because during the Australian gold rush, many of the people, many of the Chinese people who came to Australia were not intending to stay here permanently, to permanently migrate here, unlike Max Saying, who is known as the first registered migrant, Chinese migrant. So during this time in China, particularly in the Canton district, okay, there was famine and political unrest. So there were limited jobs available. And so a lot of men moved elsewhere, moved overseas to find work, and they would send money back home to their families. Now, this is the Siop district is located in the River Pearl Delta of the southern Guangdong province, close to the port of Hong Kong, where many of the ships bound for Australia sailed from. Gold was discovered not in Victoria, but in New South Wales in 1851. However, it wasn't until more gold was discovered in East Ballarat in Victoria that the gold rush fever really took hold. Many Chinese started referring to Victoria as New Gold Mountain in reference to the old or the original gold mountain, which was California, because the first gold rush was in California. So by 1858, Victoria's Chinese population has grown to around 42,000 people. So I'll repeat that, 42,000 people, Chinese population in Victoria alone. So many Chinese sojourners traveled from Canton to Hong Kong, where they boarded and sailed for about 2 to 3 months to get to Australia. Think about that. You'll be in a ship for 2 to 3 months without internet, if I may add. So many Chinese gold seekers stopped in Melbourne to get a bit of rest after that long and often difficult sea voyage. Some of them would get ill, and many would die even from the journey, and their bodies would be thrown overboard, according to some readings that I have come across. So they would head down to Melbourne first, okay, to gather provisions before heading out into the gold fields, which were in regional Victoria. So on your left is an 1866 illustration of Chinese workers unloading goods outside the Num Pun Soon building, which is located at 200 to 202 Little Bourke Street. On the right is the facade of that building, okay? And On your right now is the modern day photo of the same building. Okay, it was constructed between 1861 to 1862 as the base for the society, okay, which was established. So the society was established to support people from the Sunyi district. This building is the earliest surviving Chinese community building in Melbourne. Many other buildings were constructed in the area around this period to support gold seekers from China. It is not completely known why the Chinese settlers were concentrated in this area around Bourke Street, but one assumption is that it is relatively close to the port of Melbourne, where most ships docked, and that the rent and cost of property in this area were relatively affordable. Of course, the Chinese sojourners, when they arrived, they would have needed to find temporary dwellings. In 1851, the first Chinese lodging houses were established in a small lane off of Bourke Street, which was later named Celestial Avenue. They used to call Chinese people here Celestial, so that's probably where that name came from. By 1860s, there were at least 17 of these Chinese lodging houses between number 49 and number 150 Bourke Street East. On the leftmost part of your screen is a photo of a building constructed in 1895 as the Siap Society's housing. Next in the middle is a modern day photo of the same. On the rightmost is the former Singli Cafe, which was built in 1883, also as a Chinese lodging, but was also predominantly used as a cafe. At some point, this was also the site for a Chinese herbalist, okay, but both all of this building, both buildings were or still are in Celestial Avenue. When gold rush started to slow down, many gold seekers, the Chinese, along with other nationalities, traveled to other mining fields, such as those in Tasmania or in New Zealand. Others returned home to China, while some found themselves returning to Melbourne and working in different trades. Between 1861 and 1901, the number of Chinese living all across Melbourne had quadrupled from just 581 to 2,431, which is a significant drop from what I mentioned earlier, about 40,000 during the peak of the gold rush. So between 70 to 80% of them lived in the Gibbs Ward, which included the Chinatown area. So some of them became furniture makers. This is an illustration of Chinese carpenters in a furniture factory in Bourke Street around 1880. The building, like this one on your right, is a former cabinet makers factory or shop located in 105 Bourke Street. This building, built in 1882, is a typical late 19th century shop or factory warehouse that until recently was continuously occupied by Chinese businesses, specifically furniture makers and joiners. Around the first decades of the 20th century, the Chinatown area became a very important residential, economic, and social hub for the Chinese people in Melbourne. Many of them were young and male who worked as storekeepers, importers, furniture makers, herbalists, fruit and vegetable wholesalers, hawkers, and restaurateurs. This is a photo of workers unloading bananas outside Sun Kong Sang Banana Merchants at 201 Bourke Street in 1899. So these three buildings that you can see on your screen were constructed in 1883 at 212 to 220 Bourke Street. Many Chinese people have lived and worked in this site since 1862, well before the current buildings were constructed. These shops have been used for a range of businesses, including a cook shop, a restaurant, a general store for the Chen clan, and a banana warehouse. During and shortly after the gold rush period, grocery shops in Chinatown were not just places where the Chinese people and other customers would buy supplies or had meals. Many of the gold seekers did not know how to read. So when they received letters from home, they would go to the backs of these shops so that someone can read these letters to them and write back on their behalf. Okay, so some evenings they would also go there to gamble. So this restaurant, located at 204 to 206 Little Bourke Street, was first operated by Mi Hyung Gui from 1907 to 1984. From 1985 to 1940, it was listed under King Hong Lo and finally listed as Lingnan Cafe in 1941. The building still exists, and up until last year, the restaurant was in operation. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to have survived the pandemic and the frequent lockdowns, and last time I saw it was already closed. Now, the 1901 Immigration Restriction Act, or what became more commonly known in Australia as the White Australia policy, made it quite difficult, if not impossible, for many Chinese migrants to move to Australia, and this significantly affected Chinatown because replacement laborers for the Chinese industries became very challenging. The growing anti-Chinese sentiment during this period also affected restaurants and shop businesses in Chinatown. There were predictions during the 1940s that because of these socio-cultural challenges, Chinatown will eventually disappear. But of course, now we know that they were wrong. As mentioned earlier, the White Australia policy highly limited migration of Chinese people in Australia. In fact, during the 1940s, we saw the lowest number of Chinese people in Australia. However, the existing community flourished through the support of family stores or businesses. And during this period, many societies were established that had their clubhouses in Chinatown along Little Bourke Street. Around the 1960s, the Melbourne City Council initiated a massive redevelopment of Chinatown as a tourist precinct, which included construction of Chinese archways, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It was also around this period when the first Chinese city councillor, David Wang, held office. This photo shows him, he is second from the right, with Ron Walker, then the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Mary Byrne, Minister for Tourism, and Ta Wen-Chiu, architect, at the launch of the Little Bourke Street's Chinese-style archway around 1975. These archways are pretty interesting. Let me talk about them. Now, it was not the first time. Let's travel back a little bit. It was not the first time Chinese arches were erected in Melbourne. This image shows illuminated arches over the street with signs that says Chinese residents welcome Prince Alfred. This was around 1867. Here's another one in 1901. This is a set of two stereographic images taken in 1901 during the parades held in Melbourne to celebrate the opening of the first federal parliament of Australia and celebrate the visit of the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York. It shows the procession right here, you can see, near the Chinese Citizens Arch that used to stand along Swanston Street. So if you remember, Swanston Street is perpendicular to Little Bourke. It's the other end of Little Bourke Street. When the current arches were built in the 1970s, this one, okay, they were attached to buildings. It's not very clear here in these photos, but these arches on this side would be the buildings. They did not have standalone pillars, as you can see from here. See. Then in the mid-1980s, there was another move to revive Chinatown, and the Chinatown Historic Precinct Act of 1984 was passed. This now officially designated the stretch of Little Bourke Street between Exhibition and Swanston as the Chinatown Historic Precinct. They also established a 12-member Chinatown Historic Precinct Committee nominated by the City Council of Melbourne. The act also ensured that the conservation and promotion of Chinatown. There were several developments proposed by the committee, such as the application of urban design principles in Chinatown. Remember, Little Bourke were small streets, still are small streets, because they were service laneways for the main streets. So they also imposed new height limits for buildings, and then assigned Cohen Place as a central focus for Chinatown. I will go back to Cohen Place later because I want to show you first the studies for the arches of the Chinese gateways. On the left is a study for the Chinese gateway in Little Bourke. You'll notice that unlike the previous photo, this now has supporting pillars, as you can see here. Okay, they're now separate from the buildings. On the right is a photo of the realized design. Okay, so this would be, not sure, 1989. And as you can see, completely detached from the building. However, in 2010, these Chinese archways were again redecorated, with each one having distinct design features. They're more colorful now, okay? And the city of Melbourne recently changed the lanterns that used to hang along Little Bourke and some of the decorative elements on top of the pillars, these ones. The Museum of Chinese-Australian History has a pair of these lions on one, so they have different decorative elements depending on the arch. So this one doesn't show the lion, but a pair of lion and the global lanterns that used to hang along Little Bourke are now in the collection of the Museum of Chinese-Australian History. So there are 4 of these Chinese gateways that line Little Bourke, but there is a 5th gateway in Chinatown. So the 5th one is actually the Facing Heaven Archway, located in Chinatown Square, which is identical to the one in Melbourne, sister city, in the province of China, Jiangsu province. This was also gifted to the city of Melbourne by the Jiangsu province in 1995 to celebrate the 15th year anniversary of the Victoria-Jiangsu sister state relationship. So building this gateway and the square was made possible through the Chinatown Historic Precinct Act of 1984. During the 1970s and 80s, Chinatown was much celebrated for world-class restaurants, which started emerging to cater to more non-Chinese customers as early as the 1950s. People would go to Chinatown for dinner, families and business people alike. The province was also gifted to the city, Nope, that's another view. Oh, I think I repeated. Okay, hang on. It's the same slide. Let me switch. There we go. Okay, so among these world-renowned and fine dining restaurants is the Flower Drum Restaurant. Okay, let me just premise that none of these establishments that I mentioned are sponsors of this talk, nor do we get any payment for talking about them, but they are historically significant. Okay, so going back. So the Flower Drum Restaurant, which was originally opened in Bourke Street in 1975, but eventually moved to its current location along Market Lane, still in the Chinatown precinct. But aside from the fancy restaurant, Chinatown was also the birthplace of an iconic Australian food invented by William Chen Wing Young, who had a restaurant in Chinatown during the 1940s. So this food is the dim sum, which is not exactly like the Chinese dim sum, but they're a little bit bigger and they're fried. Okay, we now move to the present day Melbourne. Is that a video? Yeah, it is a video. Okay. And since the 1990s, the arrival of large numbers of overseas Chinese students enrolled at inner city universities, this reinvigorated Chinatown. It is important to note that the Chinese international students do not only refer to those from mainland China, but also students with Chinese heritage from other countries such as Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan, etc. So with the arrival of students, not just the Chinese students, new businesses in Chinatown were established to cater to this growing market. So now, if you walk along the streets of Chinatown, particularly Bourke, you will see fashion and beauty salons, cheap eateries and magazine stores, gaming and music stores around the district. And these shops, they also evolved based on what was popular. So now, if you, aside from dumpling houses, if you walk around Bourke, you will see a number, more than a handful of bubble tea shops. All right, so part of the redevelopment, as I have mentioned earlier, part of the redevelopment of Chinatown was the establishment of the Museum of Chinese-Australian History in Cohen Place. On the left is how the building looked like in the 80s before it became the museum. The building itself was constructed in 1905 as a storage for set and costumes for the Her Majesty's Theatre, which was just next to it. It still is. The 4-story building and the shorter one next to it, this one, here in the photo, were all part of the theater storage. So the theater the entrance is along Exhibition Street, and that building extends along towards Bourke Street. Establishing the Chinese Museum is also part of the Chinatown Historic Precinct Act of 1984. And that's significant because we needed a place to hold the stories and objects that tell the history and stories of the Chinese Australians in Australia. So if you visit the museum now, of course, after lockdown and when the borders reopen for those who are in the Philippines, you will be able to learn more about Chinatown in an exhibition that is located at the ground level of the museum. Or you can also participate in a guided tour of Chinatown, which is led by one of our visitor service officers. If that's not your cup of tea, and you prefer to explore Chinatown, Bourke, and the other laneways close to it on your own, you can ask for the special guided audio walking tour of Chinatown, narrated by historian and former museum curator Dr. Sophie Couchman. There are 12 steps in this tour, and aside from exploring the history in architecture, you will also hear stories about the present directly from 4 people who had very close ties to Chinatown. These people, many of them, or all of them, sadly have already passed away. But we're fortunate to have captured their stories on record. So if you're interested in that, when the borders reopen and when we're out of lockdown in Melbourne, head down to the Chinese Museum and ask for the audio tour. Now, the Museum of Chinese-Australian History is home to over 8,000 objects and over 3,000 archival materials and library books, majority of which were donated by members of the community. And I'm pleased to let you know that some of these, almost 2,000 of these records are now available online. Watch out for the announcement soon, how you can access that. Its mission is to preserve and present the Chinese culture and Australian history, as well as to recognize and celebrate the identity of Chinese Australian people through various activities and initiatives. You've already seen the introductory video of our latest exhibition, 1 Million Stories, but aside from that, we also have other exhibitions. We have on the second floor, the Han Dynasty Life Everlasting exhibition, which explores the significant period of Chinese history by showcasing Han Dynasty's remarkable people, progressive ideas, and great innovators. In the basement, we have an immersive exhibition named Finding Gold, Chinese on the Goldfields of the 19th Century Australia, which is you have learned a little bit during the first part of this presentation. On the ground floor, we have the Dragon Gallery, where you can see the biggest Chinese processional dragon in the world. Named the Millennium Dragon. That is this photo on your left, right? That's the Millennium Dragon. And on your right, you will see the head, so that one you won't see in the photo. So that's the head, but its body winds down all the way to the basement of the building. So we also display in the Dragon Gallery other retired processional Chinese dragon heads that have been used during citywide celebration of Chinese New Year and other festivals such as Moomba Parade. So this one is the Dailung Dragon, which is right smack in the center of that exhibition space. And this particular dragon has a very significant history for dragon making in China, which I will tell you in a little bit. Now, dragon procession has been part of Chinese culture in Australia as far back as the late Gold Rush period, where processions, perhaps not as grand as they are now, have been part of community celebrations in Melbourne, as well as in other regional parts of Victoria. For example, this photo from the museum's collection shows the procession on Bourke and Swanston Street in March 1958. Okay, so annually in Melbourne now, the Millennium Dragon, not this dragon, comes out during Chinese New Year to dance along the streets of Melbourne. Okay, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Millennium Dragon. So the Millennium Dragon, which is the successor of, the Dailung Dragon, which is the predecessor of the Millennium Dragon, is significant because it actually revitalized the dragon making history in China. Because during the late 1970s, members of the Melbourne Chinese community went to the city of Foshan to procure a new dragon. Because, these dragons are made of paper and textile and other other organic materials. And as time goes on, they have wear and tear, because obviously when they go out into the streets, people touch them, and even if it's rain or shine, they would go on the parade. So as you can imagine, they would obviously be subjected to significant wear and tear. So in the late 70s, they wanted to replace the processional dragon, and so members of the Melbourne city community, Chinese community, went to the city of Foshan. But much to their surprise, they were no longer making dragons, processional dragons in Foshan as a result of the Cultural Revolution. So what they did, okay, so they actually stopped production of processional dragons in Foshan in 1949. So what the city of Melbourne community did was they brought samples, they shipped samples of the existing dragon so that the workers, crafters, the artisans in Foshan can copy this and create a dragon. And subsequently, this resulted in revitalizing the Foshan dragon making industry after a period of over 30 years. Now, going back to the Millennium Dragon, it only comes out during twice a year, okay? Twice a year during Chinese New Year celebration and the Moomba Festival in Melbourne, which is another multicultural festival celebrated in the city. The rest of the time, it slumbers in the museum, and you can see it whenever you visit. Now, because of the lockdown, the museum has transitioned into delivering digital programs, online programs, one of which is the Digital Cultural Adventures, which is primarily for school children. So instead of having excursions into the museum now goes into the classrooms or in the homes, depending on what situation we are in, to conduct digital cultural adventures. As you can see from this slide, we have a few of them, and this is now done through a grant by the federal government. This is now done nationally across different schools in Australia. So if you're a teacher from a school, do get in touch with us and book your digital cultural adventures for your students. They are both for primary and secondary schools. And that ends my presentation. Maraming salamat sa mga nakinig. Thank you to everyone who listened. Sheshe. And the Chinese Museum has a website, as you have seen earlier. It's www.chinesemuseum. Oh, there's a missing M there. chinesemuseum.com.au. And you can email us through info@chinesemuseum.com.au, or find us on Facebook as well as in Instagram. And we also have LinkedIn, and not sure if we have Twitter, but that's it. That's the end of my presentation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Villafranca, for that wonderful talk. It was really amazing knowing more about the Little Bourke Street and the Chinese-Australian history and stories that it witnessed over the years. And also, all the pictures that you presented to us are also greatly appreciated. Me personally, as someone who hasn't had the chance to visit Australia yet, it's amazing seeing these great views and learning more about its history and relevance up to this day. So definitely, Dr. Villafranca, the moment I decide to visit Melbourne, the first thing I'll do is include Little Bourke Street in my itinerary. So Dr. Villafranca, ikaw yung una kong iko-contact. I'll contact you immediately if I do decide to go there. All right, thank you so much. So right now, we will open this space for a short Q&A portion. To facilitate this segment, we have Mr. Vito Hernandez here with us. So Kuya Vito, like Ethel, studied in the same program in Philippine Arts in the University of the Philippines, Manila. So he is an archaeologist and is currently a Flinders University International Postgraduate Research Fellow based in Adelaide. So to our audience here today, you may send your questions through the Zoom chat, and Kuya Vito will be facilitating the Q&A portion. So take it away, Kuya Vito.
Thank you very much, Charisse. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to Ethel. Good morning to Professor Labor and everyone who's attended. Thank you very much, Ethel, for that very extensive, very comprehensive talk. I really enjoyed the videos especially, and would like to actually do one of your virtual tours in the near future. That'd be great. Anyway, I won't delay this any further. So are there any questions from the audience first? You know, anyone out there itching to ask any questions?
They may still be recovering from the really long presentation.
It was great. Now maybe I can start. You know, I don't know. Usually I get criticized for this, but I'd like to start with some relatively difficult questions. You're talking about Chinese-Australians, right? But let's talk about the current situation in the world. And if we've been reading the news, how do you call this? The tensions around the Pacific, particularly with China and some countries, the Philippines in particular. But we also know, for those here in Australia, that there is some tension happening between Australia and China. And I'd want to know, being in museums, you know, being in cultural work side of it, what do you think is your role, or has there been any input from the Chinese community to soften or to ease these tensions? You know, do you feel as a cultural worker that you need to soften the tension, or is there a push from the community or from, you know, the embassy as regards that? Because, you know, especially for the students in the audience, I think one of the things that we should keep in mind is that museums and cultural work is a very powerful tool for what we call soft diplomacy. So I'd like to get your insights, your inputs, and if, you know, if there's anything happening in the background on your end.
You are correct in saying, Vito, that is a very difficult question, one that I may not be in particular qualified to address. But this I would say, okay, we continue, so the Chinese-Australian history does have a relationship with the history and the culture of mainland China. Okay, many of the members of our community hail from mainland China, but they're not the only ones that the museum caters to. And as a cultural institution, we do document all this, all the socio-cultural aspects of history. And as you would have seen in my you would have heard me talk about the White Australia policy and how that impact Chinese-Australian communities. That's part of the stories we tell in the museum. Now, it's a little bit premature still for us to make a call about what's going to happen, what's happening, because it's very difficult to talk about that right now, because it's highly charged. Okay, so it's a highly charged situation between the two countries, China and Australia, and China and the other parts of the world. And we as a cultural institution, we are trying not to meddle in the politics of it. We try to step back a little bit and do our work as promoters of community harmony, rather than throw gasoline or fuel to the fire. We continue to be a hub where members of Chinese Australian history, especially on the onset of the pandemic, when there were so many anti-racial sentiments towards Asians, particularly those who look Chinese, we had a stand about anti-racism, okay? And that's how we continue doing our work. We're not involved in the politics of it from the national level. We do have projects that we continue to liaise and collaborate with the embassies, the Chinese embassy and the Victorian Australian embassy also in China. So I hope that answers your question, so to speak.
I started with that because I noticed, let's say, following what's happening in the Philippines and looking at the Chinese, the Filipino or the Chinese Filipino community back home. So there seems to be a more independent input from the actual Chinese Filipino community back home and the museum to soften that tension but more so on the impacts of Chinese in our communities back in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Meaning, there's that Chinese, and then all of a sudden they immediately equate it to Chinese, the Chinese from the mainland and their foreign policy, when really, in fact, just by giving them a really good history and cultural background of Chinese Filipinos, then other Filipinos will be like, they're really just like one of us. And I really appreciate that you started with maxing.
Yeah, maxing.
Yeah. Maxing, because it's like saying, Chinese have been in Australia like forever. And when you see them, they're really no different from us. So it's that softening of that blow. So it might not be a direct impact, but at the same time, I realized, so coming here, and I'm based in Adelaide, I noticed that I'm not sure if it's an independent move from the Chinese within the communities here, or if or if the embassy or the consul supports it by inputting, like funding to give programs. It's like I see Chinese organizations doing so many like outreach programs and all, and that is, in a way, we don't see it, but that's like a soft diplomatic move in that sense. But these are just observations that I had, and I'd like to know how the museum is if it's consciously engaging those efforts or not, whether it's something that is a push from the embassy or from the community. But yeah, I thank you for your insights on that.
Can I add something, Vito?
Yeah, of course.
Because I've been living in Melbourne and involved in I've been living in Melbourne for 6 years now, and I have been with the Museum of Chinese Australian History for 2.5, more than 2 years, and I do continue to be involved in museums in the Philippines. And what I noticed, the distinction is that the context and the perspective of people with Chinese heritage in Australia and in the Philippines are different. So it's incomparable, the way how they see themselves. So I think that's something that we should, when we look at and try to find comparisons, that is something that we should distinctly keep in mind, that the context is different. So the reaction is different, while in the Philippines, many Chinese Filipinos would particularly identify themselves as Chinese Filipinos, not Chinese, not Filipinos, Chinese Filipinos, and many have loyalties, and I may be wrong, many consider themselves more leaning towards the Philippines. Now, I'm not saying that's the way it is in Australia, because I am unfortunately not that well versed in terms of the social aspects. And there was a recent survey that was done about that, and I haven't read extensively about how Chinese Australians see themselves. Maybe there's someone here in the Zoom room who knows more about it, can speak up about it, because I don't feel that comfortable as a non-Chinese Australian to speak on their behalf. I can talk about, history and culture, but in terms of that, I think I'm not qualified to do so. And that's
No,
all.
but no, I mean, thank you so much for actually driving that point, which is something that I totally agree with. But yes, I totally respect the fact that you say that you're not qualified to speak on the behalf of Chinese Australians. So I hope someone here who might have that kind of heritage might be willing to later on come up and weigh in on that matter.
Yeah, raise your hand if you want to speak up, so we can call on you.
Yeah, definitely. So anyway, there are several questions have been put in. So let's begin, right? I think the first question is from Professor Labor, and she says, can we assume that majority of Chinese in Australia are based in Melbourne? And if so, to what do we attribute this? But that's a question for you. So go ahead. Yeah.
I wouldn't say that majority are based in Melbourne, primarily because Melbourne is not the biggest city. Sydney is. So if you look at, maybe again, there might be, I see in the Zoom room a number of Chinese Australian experts here, professors and academics. From my understanding, Melbourne would not be the biggest concentration of Chinese Australians in Australia, primarily because we're not the biggest city. Sydney is. So why are there a lot of Chinese Australians in Melbourne? Because of jobs, and because many have settled here as well. As I mentioned, during the gold rush period, many would would go to Melbourne because the gold rush here was more significant compared to New South Wales. They also had gold fields there. The other thing also is that because those who did stay in Melbourne established businesses and communities and societies in Melbourne. And so that support mechanism is already in place in Melbourne. And in fact, the first Chinatown in the Southern Hemisphere is the one here in Melbourne, the one in Lilburg. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, Professor Labor. Well, we hope that answered her question.
Yes, I place a thumbs up. Yes, thank you, Ethel. Thank you.
All right. It's a very interesting question also, because you set off by setting the the geographic how do you call this, context of it all, and I'm just very interested. The very first people or the very first Chinese to come here traveled by sea, and I was just thinking, why Melbourne, why Sydney, why the Pacific side, when it would be easy, like if you remember, and for those who are not familiar with Philippine history, during World War II, when the then president of the Philippines had to flee the Philippines because of Japanese American, or the bombing of Manila, and which might lead into the context of similarities between Chinatown in the Philippines, or in Manila, and Chinatown in Melbourne, right? But the then president, Manuel Quezon, traveled via sea but landed in Darwin, in the Northern Territory. So I was just like thinking, why all the way in Melbourne? And I don't know if you have this data, but would you think, or is there data that there might be more, and connecting to Professor Labor's question, more Chinese, let's say, in Western Australia or in Northern Territory? I'm not familiar, so you or someone here might be.
Okay, so I think most people, when they do settle to a new land, they won't, unless they were the pioneers, they will settle where there are resources available. There are jobs, there are industries, there are, you know, where they will live. And so New South Wales and Melbourne were the biggest, Sydney and Melbourne would have been, during the gold rush periods. You have to imagine that the rest of Australia would still be very empty. There will be small settlements in the other states. But Melbourne has already been established, Sydney has already been established, and primarily because the gold rush was in Victoria. So they came by boat to Victoria, to Melbourne, because that's where the job was. And as I mentioned earlier, the sojourners, the ones who were coming here, were interested in working in the gold fields. Now, I have our CEO, Mark Wang, in the Zoom. He can answer this question better than me. Mark, would you like to speak, please? Can you unmute yourself and show us your video?
Hi there, I'm Mark from the Chinese Museum. I didn't want to interfere, Ethel, and I didn't expect you to ask me, actually, but I'm Ethel's boss at the Chinese Museum, and being a Chinese Australian and seeing Ethel having a bit of a trouble answering that question, I thought I would fill in a bit more. I'm a gold rush descendant from 1854, and I've been following this issue for a long time. And I think you were talking about why there's so many people settling in Melbourne and Sydney than in other cities which are further north, because we're the furthest away from, say, China. But that settling of Chinese in Australia has only happened over the last 50 years, because during the White Australia policy, right up to about 1950s, there was only about 12,000 Chinese Australians who could say that they were born in Australia at that time. Because of the White Australia policy from 1901 to 1960, the 1970s, all the Chinese population dwindled to nearly zero. And it's only from the 1970s when Southeast Asian people came from conflict areas like Malaysian Chinese, Indonesian Chinese, East Timorese Chinese, Vietnamese Chinese. Those are the people who came in the latter half of the 20th century to populate Australia with Chinese people. And then later in the 1990s, they came from Hong Kong, mainland China, and into the 21st century, nearly 50% of the Chinese Australians in Australia are from mainland China in the last 30 or 40 years. So and they settled. Why did they settle in Melbourne and Sydney during that time? It's because of opportunity, because Melbourne and Sydney are the biggest cities, and most of the opportunity for living in, making their living was in Melbourne and Sydney. And so this population of Chinese in Australia has not really got to do with long past history. It's to do with post-White Australia policy history. And so really that the shaping of the Chinese population has only probably happened from about the 1950s to now, in the last 70 years. Nothing to do with the period prior to that.
Yeah.
Does that give you an answer?
Yes, that answers the question more effectively than I ever did. And I just wanted to add that it was around 1972 when discriminatory immigration restrictions from the White Australia policy relaxed. So, and there was was it the Colombo Plan?
Yeah, the Colombo Plan commenced in about the 1950s. And the Colombo Plan was to do with allowing people from Commonwealth countries in Asia to actually study in Australia for improving the economies and societies of other nations. And so that's how many Chinese people ended up studying in Australia through the Colombo Plan. And that was probably the first time that Chinese people were allowed, or Asian people and Chinese people were allowed into Australia at that time.
We thank you for that, Mark. We
Thank
have Graham.
Yeah, Graham, yes.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, okay. Look, I'm a Chinese Australian person. I was actually born in Australia in country Victoria, and only Victorians will know the name of the town, a little town called Warwick-Nabil, which is about 200 or 300 kilometres northwest of Melbourne. My family's got a bit of an interesting history in Australia. Our great-grandfather apparently came to Australia, went to the goldfields, and the story goes that a miner gave him a piece of rock. He held on to that for ages, and then later on he asked someone, "What is this?" And they said, "Oh, that's a piece of gold." Now, he came out as what's called an indentured labourer, and that was almost another term for slave labour. So anyway, when he cashed in his piece of gold, he bought his freedom. And the story goes, and I haven't been able to confirm this officially, that he was one of the original investors in Little Bourke Street. And again, the story goes that he opened up a little gambling establishment, made a bunch of money, and then he decided to sell up everything. And what he couldn't take with him, he just left behind and went back to China. And then our grandfather moved to Victoria, to Horsham, then to Warwick-Nabil, and that was basically the start of our family in Australia. So anyway, that's just a little bit of history, but I thought I'd just make a comment about Chinese in Australia in general. I've been very, very lucky in my life. I'm actually an ex-Australian diplomat. I worked with the Australian Embassy in Manila. Yes, had an absolutely wonderful time there, still stay in touch with a lot of our friends there, got into the ballroom dancing scene very, very heavily. And because of that, my wife and I came back very poor because we spent all our money ballroom dancing. But anyway, we had a lot of fun. And it was interesting, I must say, being a Chinese person in the Philippines because of the very heavy Chinese influence. And I would agree with a comment that was made before. I think most Chinese Filipinos identify themselves as Filipino first, Chinese second. That was certainly my experience. But we just had the best time. And of course, my Chinese presence confused a lot of people there. I'd be introduced as the person from the Australian Embassy, and then they'd look at me and they go, "Oh, you're from the Japanese Embassy." "No, I'm from the Chinese Embassy," from the Australian Embassy. So that was quite an amusing time, and of course everybody spoke to me in Tagalog. I picked up one or two words, but not many. But Chinese in Australia, and the comment was made before by your CEO that the long history of Chinese in Australia really makes the Chinese story in Australia multidimensional. I identify as Australian first, a Chinese second. However, the fastest growing non-English language in Australia is Mandarin. There are so many new Chinese immigrants, and especially you'll see that in Sydney and Melbourne, not so much in Cairns, where I'm based, which is in North Queensland, just a very small town in North Queensland. But the Chinese presence is extremely significant. And I grew up for many years in Brisbane, another one of Australia's capital cities. Now, I grew up in what was a relatively poorer suburb called Sunnybank. However, now it's just filled with Chinese, especially from Taiwan. And then I've met a lot of people who have come in from mainland China recently. So depending on where you sit in that spectrum, I guess, will influence on how you identify yourself, whether you're Australian or semi-Australian or whatever. So the Chinese story in Australia is not homogeneous. It's a very, very varied story. Now, with there was comment about what's going on between Australia and China. Unfortunately, Chinese Australians are caught up in the story. I think for most Chinese Australian citizens, Australian citizens, they back Australia. But unfortunately, non-Chinese people will look at them and go, "Oh, well, we know where you sit." And Chinese in Australia have been relatively quiet about this whole story. I think the Chinese way of doing things is just fit in, don't make a lot of noise about things, and I think that's about where things sit at the moment. Now, whether you take a political perspective that this is all about politics and not really about something against Chinese people, well, that's you'll have to form your own opinion. But unfortunately, this government has been very, very effective at building up the anti-China story. I'll let you decide whether that is for political purposes or not. But my background with the Australian Embassy was as a trade commissioner, and I stay in touch with a lot of my friends in international trade. China is still Australia's largest trading partner. The Australian government agencies in China are still promoting Australian opportunities, for goods and services in China. The Australia Shanghai Chamber of Commerce is very, very active about, hey, Australians, get over here. There's still good market opportunities. There's a lot of beat up in Australia about China blocking Australian exports, but if you have a look at the realities of it, that they're not really the big important things. Blocking wine and small amounts of seafood and barley, really, that's not really a big thing. Exports of Australian iron ore to China have basically kept the Australian economy afloat to a large extent through this pandemic. But that is not a story that's going to be promoted by the current government. But I'm not going to take a political side. I'm just talking about the facts and figures. There is certainly a story behind this story. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Graham. Go ahead.
Before we continue, I just wanted to acknowledge that we have Dr. Michael Williams, who is an academic. He's a professor in Western Sydney. Okay, so Michael Williams is here, and he just made a comment saying that it's worth pointing out that, however, around 1900, both Darwin and Cairns had majority Chinese population. So thank you for that, Dr. Williams.
Yep, yes, thank you.
No, but it was actually Chinese that opened up a lot of Northern Australia. Fair enough, they came up for the gold rush, but when the gold petered out, they introduced crops like sugarcane and bananas. Now, the Italian communities are more known for those crops, and that's what North Queensland is known for, sugar, bananas, etc. But amazingly enough, it was actually the Chinese that introduced those crops to Northern Queensland. And I'm in the local Chinese Association, a lot of Chinese families here, they don't speak Chinese anymore. They have anglicized Chinese names. A very prominent Chinese family in Townsville. Their surname is King Sun. Well, there's no such thing as a Chinese name King Sun, and yeah, you'll see all kinds of names like that that have been very, very anglicized. People still are very Chinese, of course they are, but they are extremely Aussie.
All right, thank you very much. So I don't want to hijack this the commentary. It's great that people are getting more interested in the topic. But then I would like to bring us back to the talk and to the objective. So as you know, we in the Faura Project in the Philippines, one of the goals really is for cultural conservation, especially of cultural landscapes, one of which is what Ethel talked about. And so I'd like to point out a very interesting question that was thrown at us by the undergraduates from the University of the Philippines, Manila. It's a general one, but I think I can break it down into detail. And the question is, oh, that was one of the first ones. The question here is, given that we have a Chinatown in the Philippines, what would you say, Ethel, are the similarities and differences that they share with the one where you're at in Melbourne?
Culturally and socially, they share a lot of things. Structurally, I'm not entirely sure, because as you can see from the structures here, they are not strictly per se Chinese structures. They are how the buildings look like with the rest of Australia, physically. Socio-culturally, that's where we have a lot of similarities, because as you know, in Manila, the Chinese Filipino community was established around Chinatown initially, right? We have other places now, of course, but the support group, the support structure for social and cultural structures were established in the communities around Chinatown. And so Chinese Filipinos, as well as Chinese Australians or the Chinese sojourners, found support in the Chinatown communities in terms of, not just finding supplies from home, but also I mentioned this, that in the back of the shops you would have congregations, not just for gambling but also for letter writing and things like that. So the Chinatown became sort of like a hub for social-cultural development and support for the community.
Thanks so much, Ethel, regarding that. I hope some of the students throw in more detailed questions. But very interesting that you point that out. You said you're not so sure in terms of the structure. So one of the things that I noticed from your presentation, right, the aesthetic. When I was reflecting on, and for those people, but at least Graham has been to the Philippines, and I suppose that he's been to Chinatown in Manila, but I realized that one of the things that the Manila Chinatown doesn't really have is that strong Oriental or Chinese aesthetic that we see in the architecture. And that's because, and we have to remind people, that the Manila area was one of the most heavily bombed cities during World War II. So in terms of documentation of the Chinese aesthetic in architecture, it's almost nil, right? But it was good that you anchored in on the archways, because this is like the entrance gate or the archway into Chinatown, and all around the world is one of the highlights. And one of the things that I noticed is that the archway to, I would suppose, the Chinese museum where you work, right? That is what that's your, in a way, your classic, your stereotype aesthetic. But the one that actually leads into Bourke Street, if you can, I don't know if you can share that again.
I will.
Very, very interesting. And I don't know if I'm completely off here, but one of the things that I noticed from it, and so especially the students, you might want to zero in on this, is that when I looked at this, you know, minus the tapestry of tiles, is that the general aesthetic looks more Islamic. And I don't know if, you know, if my thinking is correct, you know, but it's like, when I look at it, it looks more like a mosque design, you know, the geometric forms and all that, minus, you know, I don't know if that is making any sense, but yeah.
If let me go to this slide over here where you have the archway. Okay, yeah. So if you look at this archway, I don't think that Islamic art has monopoly over geometric shapes. This is a duplicate of the archway in
Tianjin
province, and you're correct. It's definitely distinctly different from that of the one here that you can see in the other archways. But I'm not sure I can comment on that, how it's, because if you look at Chinese ceramic, you can see this motif and design. So I'm not entirely sure that it's that it would be, you know,
which also, by the way, so sorry that I have to weigh in on this as an archaeologist, is that the design, a lot of the early designs for Chinese ceramic actually were also heavily influenced by Islam. I have a question that might lead up to that, but I hope that tweaks some interest among our Philippine art students, you know, looking at these motifs, looking at these designs, and actually the differences and similarities in architecture. So yeah.
So if by virtue of the fact that Chinese ceramics have a lot of Muslim influence, if by virtue of that fact, then I guess you can say that it does appear to have. But I think because of the kind of world we now live in, making distinct, you know, marked line that, oh, this is strictly Chinese, this is strictly, we're more homogeneous in terms of our aesthetics and in terms of our culture. So yeah, it's something that would be definitely interesting to think about. Thank you for that question, whoever asked that.
And also maybe to detail that question, one of the things that you pointed out in your presentation, right, is you said that a lot of them went from the mining, and then a lot of them became furniture makers.
Yes.
And so like when
became furniture makers, okay, so they were looking for livelihood after the gold rush period. There were not a lot of livelihood, so furniture making became one of the work jobs industry that was heavily populated by Chinese workers. But it's not bereft of political issues as well, because at some point there were a lot of, as it is with the mining industry, a lot of ChineseAustralian furniture makers were eased out of this industry because, again, as an influence of the White Australia policy. And the non-Chinese Australians or the non-Chinese felt that the Chinese were taking over the industry, so they tried to, you know, because the Chinese workers, in furniture workers, were able to offer cheaper furniture, so they were, you know, they had more clients, and at some point the non-Chinese and non-Chinese Australians furniture makers were threatened by that, and they made a lot of move to ease out the Chinese Australians from the furniture making industry.
I asked that question because just looking at the history of Chinese furniture makers slash artisan or craftsmen, you know, for those who are maybe not familiar with Chinese in the Philippines, they also have this tradition of being craftsmen and carvers, and we see that very heavily in church art in the Philippines. So this is just to give a background to those not familiar with the Philippine Chinese history. But also when you study, you know, like the work or the art of the Santos, we call them the religious imagery, you see also influences of Chinese influence or Chinese aesthetics in that Philippine art. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in is that for these Chinese in Melbourne, at the very least, who became furniture makers, do you have in your collection, or can you show us, or can you point out to us, were their aesthetics heavily influencing the furniture that they were making, and or were they just putting out basically the aesthetic, or, you know, the furniture that that Western or Anglo-Western Australian furniture was at that time?
In our collection, and again, I think maybe other academics can pipe in. In our collection, the furnitures that we have that are from that period, they don't have Chinese aesthetics primarily, because you have to consider who their target audience were. And in that climate of white Australia policy, you wouldn't have a lot of white people, so to speak, who would be very pro Chinese culture. Okay, so who were their target market? Their target market were the white people, so they would have what the other furniture makers would have. In our collection, we have cabinets and we have drawers. They're regular drawers. In fact, one way to distinguish them from the other work of non-Chinese Australian furniture makers was a stamp. That's a way to, because they look the same. Okay, so that might not be, and again, I'm not giving that as a blanket statement saying that all of the furnitures that they made, but the ones that are in our collections are, you know, are like that. And I'm not saying again that there were no Chinese inspired designs in the furnitures, but I think for the general market, it would be your typical white person's cabinet.
And pardon the white, excuse us to the white people. But that's very, yeah, that's very interesting, because it's and for the students, I point this out for the students in particular. It's very interesting because it shows how art is not affected by the political climate. You know, so I think we should consider that a lot, and it's also how in at least with going back to Philippine art and Philippine art history, is that the artisan had so much more freedom to incorporate his own idea and aesthetic into his product. That's I think that's one of the things that we can point out in terms of a similarity and similarities and differences Very interesting. Thank you so much for pointing that out.
If I can just pipe in, because the difference also is that in Australia, it was a policy-wide discrimination. In the Philippines, it was not a legislation per se. There was discrimination against Chinese, Filipino Chinese and Chinese in the Philippines, but it was not that level where it was a national policy. And, it was interesting that you mentioned that, sculptures, even prints in the Philippines, we have, Tomas Pinpin, a lot of the sculptors, artisans trained from Chinese workers, Chinese artisans. And they, as you said, they infuse their design with the Chinese aesthetics. Like the Santos, the religious statues in the Philippines, the ones, the Mother Mary, they would have lines in their neck and they're a little bit, chunkier and things like that. So yeah, it's significantly different because again of the context. The context is quite different, socio-cultural, political.
Yeah. Hello. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. So yeah, I agree. I just want to see if we have any other questions out here. All right. I'm opening the floor for at least one more question before we wrap up. I was really very fascinated with your talk, Ethel. It was really very extensive. I apologize if I had to start with the political, but it was
I think it's hard to avoid.
Yeah, but also I think it's important what we as cultural workers have a strong responsibility to, which also, if nobody will ask a question, I want to wrap up with maybe a milder last ending question. Is that, one of the things that you ended with is your programs in the museum, and I'd like to help promote that. But I was moved by, you have an exhibit right now on the Han Dynasty.
Yeah.
Right. And forgive me, I can't help but be an archaeologist. If I remember, I'm not. That's not my period of specialization. I am an environmental archaeologist more than anything else. But if I remember that right, the Han Dynasty is the first Chinese or unified empire in that sense, right? And it's a very powerful, it's a very powerful exhibit. How do you choose, and why did you choose the Han Dynasty? And how do you choose the themes that you'll have, per period, per quarter, per month, per year? How does that go?
Well,
for you guys in the museum? Yeah.
Well, to answer that, so that's a twofold question. One, the Han Dynasty exhibition, it highlights the invention, the innovation of the Han Dynasty period. As you said, it's a significant period in China. Although we are a ChineseAustralian history museum, part of our mission is actually to not lose that ties, not politically, but culturally, historically, artistically, to the Chinese culture. So that's why we still highlight, we still have in our collection some significant works that are strictly Chinese, because you cannot detach that. I don't think, personally speaking, that it makes sense to detach that identity and just say, oh no, we're only ChineseAustralian, because you trace your roots. You are influenced by the history and the culture of your descendants. So Han Dynasty is one of that, part of our mission to continue that our mission to provide the Australian general public about what the Chinese history and culture is all about, so that it leads into an understanding of what Chinese Australians are all about, hopefully. So it explains the innovations and the contributions, the significant peoples that were part of the Han Dynasty. Now, in terms of 1 million stories, the idea for that was because 2 years ago in 2008, it marked the more than 2 million people in Australia of Chinese descent in Australia. So that was a celebration, and it was mentioned by Graham that the stories of the Chinese Australians, the Chinese in Australia, is myriad. It's very multidimensional. So it's not just one type of story, and that's the whole point of that exhibition. Sorry, it's not 2 million. Sorry, it's from the title. There are 1 million Chinese Australians. My apologies. So it's a story of, you know, different stories. It's a very colorful history that stretches to over 200 years. That's the whole point of that. And we have long-term exhibitions, but we do have temporary exhibitions that are smaller in scale and have are addressed towards fulfilling other subsets of the mission and the vision of the museum. I hope that answered your question.
No, it did. I want to point out for especially our students in Philippine Arts and how powerful I believe that exhibition is, because 2,000 years.
200 years.
Han Dynasty?
Oh, Han Dynasty. No, yes, Han Dynasty.
Yeah.
Yes.
So why it's powerful when you presented that you have an exhibit like that is because one of the things that is highlighted is connecting it to the Philippine, to Philippine history, is that if for the students, right, you see this archipelago, the Philippines, and you have all of these tribes or different groups, right, before they're unified by sultanates. That is what the Han Dynasty did for China. It unified a lot of different smaller nations to become what we might, or what, I don't know if, I'm not also a Chinese history expert, but how I think of it as like a real Chinese nation, an empire in that sense. So it's very powerful if you bring it into this setting, how Chinese culture can be unifying. And that's how I looked at it. And so I wondered if the impetus for creating or for putting up an exhibit like this was to send out that message. Aside from, of course, the bringing the connections or back to the roots of Chinese Australians. But yeah, I think you were able to answer that question very well. Thanks so much, Ethel. Now, it's actually 2 minutes before 12 noon in the Philippines and 3 o'clock in Melbourne, 2:30 here in Adelaide. So we're about 2 hours in, and I think it's about the end of our well, I hope it didn't end. It's a Sunday, it's a long weekend here. But I'm very interested in that people, or I hope that more people can continue this discussion on your museum. Congratulations. Well done to you guys over at the museum at Little Bourke. I wish you all the best, Ethel, in your career and your endeavors. So we're of course friends on social media, and I love following her food posts more than anything else. And of course those lovely earrings, love it. I can't stop. It's just like the first thing. So yes, I'll stop because I'm fanboying now, and so I'll leave it to the beautiful women back home in Manila, Professor Labor and to Charisse, and And thank you again, Ethel, and good afternoon to everybody. Take it away.
Okay, Charisse.
All right. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Villafranca and Kuya Vito, for that very insightful and wonderful Q&A session. So, all right. Before we formally close our webinar session today, let me call on Dr. Achanzar-Labor again for the closing remarks.
Okay, so so thank you, Cha. No. And of course, thank you, Mr. Vito Hernandez. Thank you, Vito, first for your presence, and second for conducting the question and answer section of today's activity. I can't think of anyone more fitting to conduct this, as you are also just like Ethel are based in Australia right now. So, and then we are celebrating Australia's History Week, of course, together with the Philippines Museum and Gallery Month. So, and we thank to everyone who presented questions as well as insights, which made our discussion most engaging. Of course, primarily Mark and Graham, who also shared with us a lot of their insights on the subject matter. But of course, we thank most especially our guest, Dr. Ethel Villafranca, who has served as our eyes to a part of Australian heritage, which we also share in the Philippines, since we also have our own Chinatown here. So we appreciate very much your extensive discussion on the subject, Dr. Villafranca. And we thank you all, everyone who are here right now, for simply being here, since this is what inspires us to further our advocacy of promoting heritage cities and streets. Your interests keep us going and put premium value to pride of place. So we formally end then today's event. Looking forward to seeing you again in our future activities. And please make sure to regularly check our Facebook page for updates. So that's a Faura Project Facebook page. And we turn you back for a brief moment to Charisse. So thank you once again, everyone. Cha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Achanzar-Labor. Okay, so before we formally end, I'd like to request everyone to turn on your camera so we can take a quick picture to commemorate this very wonderful webinar session. So yes, if you may, please turn on your cameras.
Camera?
Yes, all right. Okay, let's wait for a few more people. Yes, let's all show our faces and our smiles this Sunday morning and afternoon. All right, I think I can take the picture now. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, one more. 1, 2, 3, smile. All right, thank you very much. And I'm sending in the Zoom chat our evaluation form so that we can know how to serve you better in terms of making our webinars the best that it can be. So please note that if you want to request an e-certificate, you have to answer the evaluation form. Okay, thank you so much to everyone for attending. Please have a great Sunday and enjoy this time with your family. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you again, all.